Graham.
Thank you. Before lunch, I was asking you some questions about independence and conflict.
Yes.
To ask you to comment. As I understand the information we have, there was a code of conduct for employees who worked for PIRC at least in March 2014. And that gave some guidance to members of staff about conflicts and maintaining independence and what would happen if they were faced with an ethical dilemma. I think I touched on this earlier this morning, that the police are a hierarchical organisation with rank, and I asked certain witnesses to give evidence about whether individual officers would feel they could speak up if they saw something that they weren't comfortable with. And I want to ask you that in relation to PIRC. Do you think individual investigators would feel comfortable speaking up if they saw something they weren't happy with, or they felt something wasn't being done properly?
By Police Scotland senior manager?
In relation to PIRC. Let's say, first of all, a PIRC investigator sees something being done in relation to another PIRC investigator, or they've missed something, or they feel concerned about something. Do you think they'd be willing to speak up about that?
These sort of things are an individual choice. I think the atmosphere and the way that the organisation operates would encourage that sort of thing. But sometimes for people that's not enough. So I couldn't comment on everyone on a personal basis, but certainly for me, I would, if I was giving an opinion on that, I said that the organisation was very open and would encourage reporting of anything such, because, as we discussed before, the independence aspect and the public perception of what we do is highly important to stand and fall by that. So I say we'd always encourage staff to bring any like issues to the attention of senior management.
And would you say that the atmosphere in PIRC is quite encouraging and open to discuss constructively issues that arise?
Yes, I would say so, yes.
Let's look briefly at the Code of Conduct. The Chair can obviously read this at his leisure. It's PIRC 04574, and this is dated March 2014, Code of Conduct for Employees. And do you recognise that document on the screen? Well, very briefly, it says at the outset that it's an important document and it sets out the standards of behaviour that PIRC expects of its staff. And you should read it, and if you do not understand how the code applies to you, you should ask your line manager to go through it with you. And in future it will be part of the induction process, so all new staff will have it drawn to their attention when they start work. Was this available to all staff?
Yes. We've had an induction process which is sort of grown over the years, and one of the parts of that is to for all staff to make themselves aware of the various procedures and processes and the documents that relate to them.
Right. And is that something you've been through as well, the induction process, or was it just for new staff?
Just for new staff, yeah.
And we'll see on the front page as we scan down, there's diversity and equal opportunities. PIRC attaches high value to diversity and working to eliminate unlawful discrimination. And there's identifying and declaring a conflict of interest. I asked you before lunch about certain situations and whether you'd felt that was necessary to declare an interest. But it's this code of conduct that sets that out.
And that's certainly something I've been involved in the past, where staff have declared potential conflict to err on the side of safety for investigations that they've worked in.
And then security and confidentiality of information, and that's reinforcing the requirements in terms of data protection, and then concerns about improper conduct. And the code also explains what you should do if you have a concern that illegal or improper activities may be going on in PIRC, and how to raise those. And if we can go on to page 5, please. in the centre of this page, this is the introduction. If we can look at the centre of the page, there's a section independence. And it says, we demonstrate our independence by our resolve under pressure, the people we appoint, the work we undertake, scrupulously avoiding conflicts of interest, our organisational culture and the communications we make. When it says the people we appoint, what does that mean?
I think that means the people that are taken into employment in the organisation or are appointed to move to a more senior level internally within the organisation.
When people are appointed, is there a process where they're asked about any, independence and the importance of that's explained, and they're asked about any conflicts or issues that they may have?
When appointed to the organisation initially?
Yes, independence is demonstrated by the people we appoint. So when those people are appointed, is there a process where that's gone through?
A lot of these will be touched upon in the interview processes because, again, equality and diversity in particular is a major thing within the organisation, has become even more important over recent years. And invariably that will be included in some aspect through the interview process.
When you were appointed, was independence discussed with you?
I believe it was.
Do you remember anything about that, or
not specifically, I'm afraid, no.
Was the fact you'd been in the police for almost 30 years raised with you to see whether you could be independent as part of the team of PIRC?
I think there was some form of questioning I recall through the interview process in relation. I'm sure there was in relation to that, and how you could kind of demonstrate that, and again, so that the public perception was such that although you may have served a long period in the police, that you had the capability and to be independent and to evidence that in some way in how you articulate that.
Thank you. Can we look at page 7, please? There's a number of bullet points listed. As an employee, you have a responsibility to, and I won't read all of these, but we can see that as an employee of PIRC, you have a responsibility to treat complainants, those investigated, and other stakeholders with fairness, courtesy, and sensitivity to their needs and the situation they're in. There's consider others in the exercise of your duties, express your point of view without being aggressive or overbearing, and learn from your mistakes. Those are just some I've read out.
Yeah.
And was it something you were aware of, that those responsibilities were part of the duties of a PIRC employee?
Yeah, very much so.
And was the importance of those made clear to PIRC employees?
Yes.
Now, we've heard evidence that you've talked about getting support from the police as part of your investigation. We've heard evidence that as part of the actions taken by Police Scotland on the 3rd of May, that officers were brought into Kirkcaldy or into the investigation to assist generally. And some of those came from other legacy force, Fife Police. So in May 2015 it was Police Scotland, but prior to the 1st of April 2013, there'd been a number of legacy forces, one of which was Fife Police. You're aware of that?
Yes, I'm aware.
And we've heard evidence that some officers were brought in from former legacy Fife Police areas to help with the investigation. Was that of any concern to PIRC that there were former Fife Police officers helping in relation in Kirkcaldy with the investigation?
I was aware that other officers were drafted to support their investigation initially. I don't recall being aware of where they had come from. I don't think at that stage. Certainly latterly after that, but I'm not sure about on the date.
Is it of any concern to you now, if you take it from me that there were officers brought in from former Fife police officers brought in from other areas in Fife to help with the investigation, would that have been any concern to you at the time?
Not a huge concern, and I think with these things, what you would prefer and what is practical in the circumstances is because there were a lot of resources there, obviously, including our own, so it wouldn't be a major concern to me at that stage.
So you've said a huge concern if they were coming in from Fife areas.
No, it wouldn't. No, it wouldn't be a.
It wouldn't be
No.
a huge concern.
No.
Right. Sorry, I misheard you there. Would it have been of any concern to you about issues of conflict, or would you not have considered that matter at all?
It would have been difficult to know that. You would, the majority, I would anticipate, you would be reliant on the senior managers and the division itself to oversee that properly. I know at a reasonably early stage they ended up getting additional resources from the major investigation team, and part of that was the specialist skills, but part of that was that they were not part of the structure in that local area either.
Looking at the situation now, as a PIRC investigator coming in, reliant on Police Scotland resources, would you have a preference about whether it would be officers from a totally different area who supported PIRC?
Yeah, in an ideal world, that would be better, and that's dependent on what you were asking them to do or directing the Police Scotland to do. If it was, for instance, which we had a lot of, was control of the scenes, then it didn't really matter to my mind where these officers come from, because they're basically just doing a specific role, which if they were even local officers, it shouldn't compromise that. If they're doing a more important specific role, then that's probably more of a consideration.
Could you help us understand what a more important role might be?
Well, for instance, the initial contact with the family members. Obviously, I don't know what went into that as far as selection of the individual officers who ultimately interacted with the family at the early days, but that would be one of them. And
given what you've said, would your preference be that they would come from a separate area out with Fife?
I would suggest that would be helpful, but maybe impractical. That's the balance and the difficult thing.
The chair has a statement from a Maurice Rhodes. He, I understand, was an investigator.
He was, yeah.
Yes. And his statement talks about his experience on the 3rd of May, and he was asked to comment on some other evidence we've heard about Pat Campbell, the SIO. And Pat Campbell, I think as you're aware, had described some concerns about PIRC having limited resources.
Yeah, I'm aware of that. Yeah.
You're aware of that as well.
Excuse me.
And I think Pat Campbell in evidence had talked about he had probably about 20 or 22 resources at one time from Police Scotland, and they were detective officers involved in the investigations, but he thought that PIRC turned up with 4 or 5. I think you've said that it was a total of 6.
6 and 1 elsewhere, yeah, 7 in total.
Casey was in Hamilton Police Office. So those were Pat Campbell's concerns, and Maurice Rhodes was asked to comment on that, and he says in his statement, reference to Pat Campbell, his opening comment as we walked into the office that day was, and this is in quotation marks, it's a Strathclyde police reunion, and that was Pat's opening comment. Can you recall Pat Campbell making that comment when
Definitely not, no.
Was there a view that day in Kirkcaldy Police Office that the people who arrived from PIRC to do the investigation were from Strathclyde Police?
Not to my knowledge.
Or that individual...
Most of the 5 officers probably would not know them anyway, so they wouldn't know the origins of their previous employment. I wouldn't have thought. Obviously, Pat Campbell's from the wider Strathclyde force previously, and a couple of others that were there, but the majority were Fife.
So Pat Campbell had worked in Strathclyde?
Yes.
And you'd worked in Strathclyde?
Yes.
Who else had worked in Strathclyde at that time that was there?
Or the only ones that didn't were Stuart Taylor and Alex McGuire.
They're the only officers that hadn't
That didn't work
investigators.
with Strathclyde,
Didn't
yeah.
work.
Alec McGuire was an ex-officer, but not with Strathclyde Force.
Right. And Taylor, I think, had come from out with the police service. You've said that. Can I ask you some questions about another point, a separate point, about Richard Casey? You were asked to comment on this in your inquiry. You'd noted down something about involved with David Green and your involvement, and you'd written the words political side K ? Do you remember being asked about this? No.
Could you say that again?
I'll find the passage. Let's look at, maybe we could look at your notebook, PIRC 04528, page 1. And you'll have to help slightly with the handwriting here, if you don't mind. My understanding is that this says, and please tell me if I'm wrong, Sunday 3rd May 2015, 1000 hours. Sunday 10 AM, DSI Harrower David Green. You can see the names there. And then instruction ? And then beneath that it says political side, and then K ?
Sorry, what time is that against?
Well, it says Sunday 3rd May 2015 at 1000 hours, 10 AM. That's what's written there. And then beneath that there's a reference to 9:35. So it looks like...
Who's that's somebody else's notes?
Right. Well, let's leave that to one side if that's not your notes. I think you were asked about this in your inquiry statement. I don't have the number for it, but if you give me a moment, I'll be able to find it, I think. And you say, I cannot specifically recall why I noted political side down, but this, I think what I'll do is I'll stop asking questions at this stage, and I'll find out exactly where this information is from.
So I've responded to that. That's
yes,
probably because
I'll go back to this.
I don't know that's Mr. Casey's notes.
I'll go back to this at a later stage, rather than digging a bigger hole for myself here. Can I turn to looking at the actual investigation that was carried out on the 3rd of May, and thinking about issues of adequacy and reasonable promptness? I want to go through some of the events in the afternoon with you. Now, we know the first Gold Group meeting, we've heard evidence about this. It was at 11:30 in the morning in Kirkcaldy Police Office, and it was chaired by ACC Nicholson. Now, we've heard evidence that no one from PIRC was in attendance at the first Gold Group meeting in the morning. And I wonder if we can ask you to explain a little bit more about why nobody from PIRC went to that meeting.
Well, I wouldn't have been able to get there in the time scale. That would be the main thing. If you look at the initial time spent in various phone calls and organising things, speaking with PSD, speaking with Pat Campbell, then considering and what additional staff we had to call out, that's taking us to a point where, with even taking travelling distance, if there was a potential to go straight from my residence to there, we never got there for 11:30 anyway.
Can you give the chair an indication of how long it normally takes to mobilise PIRC and to mobilise a team to attend an investigation?
That would be very difficult to estimate, because every circumstance is different. Obviously, the big point is the geographical location of where you're going. If you've other resources to bring out who are not on call, they may be harder to get depending on where they are. So, for instance, the 2 additional investigators I called out were specifically to carry out scene management functions. You know, if they're not in the house, they're doing something with their family, then, but they're the only ones you're going to be able to get, then it's going to take longer. So you could never really estimate how long it would take. There's a accumulation of factors there that will change the timescale for a response.
So on the particular day in question, the 3rd of May, you've had your initial call at 9:35 from David Green.
Yes.
You've had a number of other calls, we've spoken about some of those today, in relation to the investigation. And was there simply not anyone available to go to Kirkcaldy Police Office at that stage?
No, there was. I mean, obviously the on-call team that were scheduled to be on call were contacted and notified. I don't recall whether I got them on the first phone call or not, but within a reasonable timescale I got a response and organised for them to mobilise and come out, and then got the additional members of staff to add to that on-call team as well.
Do you, as a practice, arrive in an office or at an incident together as a group when you arrive from PIRC? Or do you arrive individually? Or is there no preference?
There's no real preference. It's majority of times you'd be travelling probably 2 to a car. So you may arrive kind of roughly the same time, but you may be diverted to do something en route, or you may be required at another location. So again, there's various permutations of how you would deploy and the reasons behind that.
And are the cars kept at Hamilton, at your offices there?
At that time, I think we had certain ones that the on-call team had, but obviously we had other members of staff coming out that didn't have cars, so there would be a requirement to organise additional transportation that would be sitting at Hamilton, stored near the office, and then any other equipment or on-call material to deal with, like, taking productions and so on and so forth.
And did anyone consider joining the Gold Group meeting by phone?
No, we didn't. And obviously we didn't have the facility. I know we quite regularly joined by Teams, which wasn't an option back then.
But is that something that you more commonly do now?
Yes. Yeah. In fact, it's particularly if there's a deployment of staff, and maybe a DSI will go out with the team, and one of the other DSIs or a senior investigator will log in to the Gold Group meetings. So.
Are there benefits to PIRC being present at all the Gold Group meetings, especially the first one?
Oh, you obviously you would hope you would get more first-hand information and inputs from other police managers, as opposed to all that information being channeled through one person. Yeah, so I would say probably advantages from that.
And when you say one person, is that the SIO you mean?
Yes.
Having the contact with you. And tell us, not having been there, how did you then go about getting information about what was said at that first Gold Group meeting?
By speaking to Pat Campbell.
Did you receive copies of minutes at any stage?
Not to my recollection. I don't think they would have been, although they would have been handwritten, but they would later be typed and compiled into a formal minute. So I didn't see those at those times.
So were you dependent on Pat Campbell's recollection or his own notes of the first Gold Group meeting?
At that stage, yeah.
Do you remember if you were told anything or given an update about family concerns at that time?
At the goal group,
In relation
meeting
to the
at the time.
first Gold Group meeting?
obviously I was well aware, I think at the second one, of the family concerns and what was fed back from the visits to the house. I'm not sure about prior to that.
Was there, do you remember now, if there was much discussion between you and Pat Campbell about what had been said at the first Gold Group meeting?
I'm sorry, I can't recall specifics on that. I'm sure he would have mentioned that. But
All right. You've mentioned in your statement about there being a briefing in Hamilton at your PIRC office.
yes,
And that would be just before midday that day?
yes,
And was that for all the investigators who were going to be involved in the investigation?
yeah, and Ricky Casey as well.
And Richard Casey. And I think you say in your second statement at paragraph 43, you didn't ask investigators to attend directly to Kirkcaldy Police Office, and that was the most appropriate response. Can you explain why you didn't simply ask them all to attend at Kirkcaldy?
Well, I touched on the equipment and the vehicles, and I wanted to brief them prior to arriving at Kirkcaldy as well, because you never know how that's going to play out, what could be available to do that. You may never get the opportunity to actually do it with whatever's taking place. So you could stand and look at it both ways, that you could have sent somebody immediately or collect. That's what I decided to do on the day.
And what equipment was necessary to be picked up or collected?
Well, you have a lot of what we call a kind of production kit, which is like labels, bags, swabs, anything that the scene managers could go into a lot more detail of what type of material they would take with them.
Do you have a note anywhere of what was said at that briefing?
No.
There's no details of that in your operational notes?
That was basically just done as an overview or summary of the information that I had been provided from the 3 different sources at that stage.
Did you prepare any paperwork in advance of the briefing?
No, not at that stage.
Setting
No.
out what you were going to say?
No, and that would obviously have taken more time to do that as well.
When you were giving the briefing, did you rely on your operational notes to speak to the other investigators?
Yes, partly, yeah.
And so the information that was in your operational notes may have been shared with those other...
Yeah, verbally, not physically. I wouldn't have thought
Yeah.
as in the notes themselves, but yeah.
We have a statement from Alex Maguire, who you've mentioned today, paragraph 20. I won't ask for it to be put on the screen, but he has noted down, upon arrival, encountered the suspect who ran at a female officer and attacked her wielding a knife. So again, does that sound similar to the sort of notes you had in your operational notes that you were being shared? So again, it would appear that the story or the version of the subject being the aggressor seems to have been shared with all of the investigators from PIRC.
Yeah, but it wasn't to convey it. It was just conveying a summary of the information that I'd been provided. There was no intention to to paint that picture. It was just that was the information we had.
So that information again was shared with the investigators
Yes,
who were going to
it
be
was.
involved, and that was Richard Casey, who was present, although he
Yes.
remained in Hamilton, Alex Maguire, Gary Sinclair, John Ferguson, Stuart Taylor and Maurice Rhodes.
Yeah. And I'm sure I conveyed to them at that time what my initial thoughts were on what they would be deployed to do. So that was another consideration for them to be aware of that before they got there, so they could focus their minds on how they were going to approach that depending on what they were faced with when they arrived.
And what did you say about what they were going to be doing? This was around midday on the 3rd of May.
Yeah,
Was it individual tasks for each of them, or was it a general
as
overview?
tasks as pairings for the scene at Hayfield Road and at the hospital. Right. And basically, Alec Maguire was going to support me. We spoke about the scribe role earlier on. That was one of the things, just to assist me in retaining any of the information that was being passed at the various meetings.
And did you explain to them about the split, the parallel investigation at that time?
I don't think so, no. No.
What impression did you give those investigators in relation to the scope of the investigation that was to be done by PIRC, if you didn't explain the split?
Well, I spoke about the responsibilities for each of those 2 locations, but we obviously were going to find out more of what, particularly for Hayfield Road, what else that would involve, and that subsequently there was other tasks that were added in relation to Gary Sinclair's role as the scene manager for that scene, and things that had to be accomplished at Kirkcaldy office as well as that scene.
Did you make it clear to those investigators, when you were talking about the information that you'd received about the events, that you had not asked and did not know the source of that information?
I don't think that was something I would have mentioned.
Did you make it clear to them that you could not provide any assurances as to the accuracy of that information?
I don't have any recollection of that. That's probably not, unless there was a specific reason, that's maybe not something that I would mention anyway at that stage.
Did you encourage them to keep an open mind in relation to the investigation?
Very much so, and we would always do that, particularly in, these types of investigations.
And these were many of these investigators, we've heard their names before. Some will have taken statements from the officers early in June,
yes.
A later stage.
Yes.
So some of them will have been involved in the investigation for a number of weeks at least.
For a long period, yeah.
Now, can you help us understand why Casey, a senior investigator, did not travel to Kirkcaldy Police Office with the other investigators?
That was a decision he made. He was going to deal with media issues and anything else that would arise.
Because he was a senior investigator that day,
That's
wasn't
correct,
he?
yeah.
There was no one else there in Kirkcaldy that was of the same seniority as him on
No.
the 3rd of May.
No.
You were a deputy senior investigator.
Yes.
We've got some other information in a statement that's been signed and available to the chair, that although he said he would man phones, that Irene Scullion may actually have been manning phones. Do you know anything about that?
I can't remember if I know she was in the office the following day. I can't honestly recall whether she came into the office on the Sunday or not. I'm not sure. I know she was made aware of the incident, I'm quite sure. Right.
Would there have been benefit in Ricky Casey travelling to Kirkcaldy and becoming a sort of 7th investigator at Kirkcaldy Police Office that day, so visible in Kirkcaldy? Would there have been some benefit to having him present?
There may have been.
Did he have any particular skills that might have been of use to PIRC that day?
Oh, as I mentioned earlier, he was one of the PIM trained people, but obviously as far as we were concerned at that stage it hadn't gone to that level. Right. But he's a very experienced investigator in his own right.
And if he'd been present, would that may have released someone else from a task to do something in addition, maybe rely less on Police Scotland?
Possibly.
Do you think an extra pair of hands would have been helpful to your investigation?
Well, obviously, the priorities and tasks that I was setting was dependent on what we had there and what Police Scotland resources were considered appropriate and necessary to undertake those.
We've heard that you arrived at Kirkcaldy at 1:30 or thereabouts.
Thereabouts, yeah.
When you arrived, did you make yourselves known
Yes.
to Police Scotland? How did you go about doing that?
I think I sought out Pat Campbell because he had been the senior officer that I'd been speaking to.
Do you remember where Pat Campbell was when you arrived at Kirkcaldy?
Not specifically, no. I mean, he was clearly, for obvious reasons, he was a man in high demand with, various people constantly seeking direction. So I sort of spoke to him intermittently at different stages.
Where were you when you first spoke to him?
We were, I don't know where this is more likely, we were at a very early stage given a small office in the building somewhere. I don't recall where that was, but I think it was quite close to where Colin Robson was, I think. So maybe it was part of the CID corridor at the time, I'm not sure. But I think it was either there or somewhere close to there. And at some stage, I think in some sort of meeting room, we had the handover that you described.
Did you remain in that or around
Yes.
that office?
Yeah.
You didn't spread out in the police
No,
station?
until the rest of the team were sent out to carry out the various tasks, because I'm sure the forensic strategy meeting that we had with Stuart Houston was, I'm sure, in the same office as well later on.
So how long did you remain in that office that day, initially at least?
For a fair period, and on and off, I was back and forward, and then obviously in attendance at the Goal Group meetings, which I think were in a bigger room upstairs, I think.
Apart from the forensic strategy meeting and the Gold Group meetings, did you remain largely in the office apart from that, or were you elsewhere as well?
I was elsewhere at times, but I spent a fair bit of time in there and was on the computer and was writing up stuff as well. You're aware that the briefing document that was concluded, I did parts of that while I was there.
We'll come on to that. Now, I think in your statement you talk about tasking the investigators to manage the hospital, Victoria Hospital,
Yeah.
and Hayfield Road.
Yes.
And that was in conjunction with the Police Scotland scene manager, DCI Stuart Houston.
Yeah, he was the coordinator for all the Police Scotland scene managers.
When did you task officers in relation to the hospital?
Well, our investigators were aware they were going to be dealing with that from Hamilton.
The briefing?
Yeah,
from
from the briefing originally, and then that was reinforced at different stages, particularly following the forensic strategy meeting, how the deceased was going to be dealt with and how we would approach that.
And we've heard about a forensic strategy meeting in the afternoon. I may be incorrect in my recollection, but it was roughly around 4 o'clock or something like that. Someone will correct me if I'm totally wrong on that. Was it after that forensic strategy meeting, in any event, that the officers were told to deal with the hospital and Hayfield Road?
Yeah.
Was there any reason you waited for the forensic strategy meeting to take place first?
Because it's important to plan out these things. You only get one opportunity. I think we had to get an input from the Police Scotland scene management side, because they, particularly with both locations, but particularly Hayfield Road, you're aware there was a lot went on at that scene from the first stages, and items were recovered, etc. So Gary Sinclair, who was taking the lead at that location, it was important that he was aware of everything that had gone before, particularly from the scene managers, and then taking that forward, how we're going to implement and finish off that process. So there's a lot involved in doing that and getting it right. Because it might sound funny that there's no hurry. These scenes are locked down. That's the purpose of maintaining the Police Scotland officers there to secure that. So that gives you the time to prepare properly and have a plan of action and how you're actually going to deal with that.
And then, what were your expectations after you've had the strategy meeting? What were your expectations in relation to the officers going to these scenes, to Hayfield Road and to Victoria Hospital? How long would that take them?
After they left, a considerable period of time.
Why would that?
A long period, because there was a lot to do. Plus, Gary Sinclair, who was responsible at Hayfield Road, was delegated to oversee the equipment from the officers. We saw the importance of the PAVA canisters, etc., and part of that strategy meeting was an insistence that these were weighed properly to give us an idea on how much of that substance had been discharged during the incident. That wasn't initially a consideration, as far as I was aware, from the Police Scotland side. So there was a lot more from actually the physical Hayfield Road scene itself, but what was to be accomplished at the office, and then there was obviously other inquiries ongoing as regards house to house, which I'd discussed with Pat Campbell, and a decision made to let that run as it was at that time, to make sure that we could identify any significant witnesses, that there was a requirement to again establish the facts of any independent witnesses in the absence of the police accounts at the beginning.
Of the investigators you tasked with going to Victoria Hospital,
yeah,
what was the strategy that was agreed at the meeting in relation to that?
There was various things discussed as regards how the recovery would take place, if any samples were to be taken prior to leaving the hospital, getting the body to the hospital in the manner and how that was going to be done. So these things, they all take a long time to achieve properly.
What were your expectations of the officers tasked with dealing with the hospital, about how long after the forensic strategy meeting it would take them to get to the hospital?
I think it was fairly soon thereafter. I don't have exact times on that.
Looking back now, do you think, because the chair would like to perhaps make recommendations in the future, do you think there's ways that the response time of the investigators could be improved, in terms of, we've heard the incident happened and Mr. Bio had been taken by ambulance roughly around 7:30 in the morning. You've had a call at 9:35 from David Green. Life is pronounced extinct in relation to Mr. Bio at 09:04, and you don't arrive to Kirkcaldy till 1:30. Do you think there's a way that that process could be made more efficient, speeded up, faster? Is there anything that could be done to help speed that up?
Yeah, I think there could be, and I say now the approach would be slightly different. We spoke about the initial goal group meeting, which would facilitate that early communication on a lot of these things that we've discussed, and that would be done. We would have had somebody at least on Teams now logging in to that meeting, so that dialogue would take place, so it would be clearer to Police Scotland what was actually happening. We obviously have a lot more staff now, significantly more staff than
how many?
We did then. I think we had total about 25 at that time. Now we've got in excess of 60.
Right.
So, ergo the availability of individuals and the skilled personnel that you need for these incidents would maybe more readily available. Although the on-call teams are pretty much the same, it's the same numbers, and then if you have to outsource further to try and get our own skilled personnel, then that would be subject to being able to contact them and call them out.
And can you see any way of minimising or reducing the period of time between PIRC getting the call to become involved and do an investigation and actually getting people on site?
The approach now, and has been for a few years, completely different, because any incident like this would fall into a formal post-incident process. So you would have the list that you ran over from that previous document of the senior investigators, the deputy senior investigators. They would all be involved in this very quickly. If we couldn't get to the post-incident process again, we would remotely go into that, so that process would start. We would have the checklist of things in relation to conferring and recovering of relevant material, including basic facts and initial accounts. So that's a process that is done very, very regularly now, and works very well.
Take a moment and look at that. This was the document we looked at this morning, PIRC 04438, and it's the final page of that document. And it says minimum deployment of PIRC personnel. Are you saying that nowadays that would be the minimum deployment?
Yes. So you'd have at least 2 going to the post-incident process. So you'd have the PIM aware investigator included within that. So, and the ability to take productions, etc., through that process. So you then have a PIRC manager would be involved in charge of the scene or scenes with appropriate staff. If you had a number of scenes, then there would be more staff there to deal with those, and they would link in with Police Scotland at the appropriate level.
But in May of 2015, obviously we can see that there's at the scene there are 5 individuals envisaged there as a minimum deployment, and for PIM suite there's 4, so that's a total of 9 envisaged as a minimum deployment in this document, and we know that you had 6. When you arrived with 6 investigators in Kirkcaldy in May 2015, did you already feel you were perhaps not meeting the minimum deployment that's envisaged?
But that again is in relation to the firearms discharge type scenario. The post-incident process was something that didn't occur that often at all at that stage. I think from some of the stuff I've heard from even Police Scotland, knowledge and even at a senior level was very limited on how that process worked. If this had been determined as a full post-incident process, then potentially the resourcing levels would have been different to facilitate that.
And if we go back to page 1 and we see that firearms include the discharge of CS gas, if you keep going down page 1, we'll see the 4 bullet points, and the final one is discharge of gas, CS gas. So on the face of it, it would appear that where there's been a discharge of gas, the minimum deployment is those 9 individuals.
I don't assess it as that. I don't agree with that. And I think in the first paragraph you'll see that it's the wording of it, a fatal
We can go up to the top, there's
Yeah.
firearms mentioned, and
because
that's the definition of firearm.
it's because of the legislation
Right
that
to the
the
top.
discharge of PAVA or CS spray is classified in that manner. However, we get hundreds of these referrals every year to deal with as a single entity after, so that's classified as being discharged, but it's not at that level. To my mind, this is directed towards, a lethal barrel weapon being discharged and potentially somebody being fatally shot.
So in May of 2015, your impression was that this document didn't really have any bearing on the situation you were in?
It was designed, as it says in the heading, for following police use of firearms. And I know what you're saying about during this incident, PAVA was discharged, but to my mind, that's not what that's intended for. That is the kind of highest level, and now all death investigations, most of them will involve that process now, because the whole process was changed and where a post-incident process would be implemented in response to that. But that was some of the significant changes after the incident in 2015.
So nowadays, it's quite clear that it would be applicable to any death investigation, not just one involving a firearm or a
Not
gun.
any death, but certainly a death in custody would definitely be. Death following police contact would be slightly different, where it's removed from direct interaction with the officers when the death occurs.
Can I ask you about the officers arriving at Victoria Hospital? So we've heard evidence that they didn't arrive until near 7 o'clock in the evening. And I'm wondering if you have any concerns about the length of time that it took PIRC officers to actually get to Victoria Hospital?
I think after the strategy meeting, they would be further engaged with the Police Scotland scene managers that had the initial responsibility for those two scenes. So there's probably a lot to achieve after that. And I've said already, both of these locations were secured, or stood by police officers, and had been since 7 o'clock in the morning. So that position shouldn't have changed. So yes, would it have been better if it had been earlier? Absolutely. But it should be the same what they're faced with when they arrive, whether it's 2 hours later. So.
Did you have any concerns at that time about preservation of evidence and a delay in getting PIRC there, having an impact on maybe not being able to preserve the best evidence?
For the same reasons, no. I would be happy that these locations were secured, had been for 2 or 3 hours before we were even made aware, and then subsequently over that period.
Did you later become aware that when PIRC arrived at the hospital, they realised that the police officers had been sitting in a room with Mr. Byles' body and without forensic clothing?
I don't think I was aware that night. I heard that through the inquiry itself.
Right. And did you become aware at any stage about issues to do with samples and bags perhaps lying open, anything like that?
I don't recall that. No.
Again, thinking to the future, is there a way that you could see that the response time could be improved? So obviously, Mr. Byles pronounced life extinct at 09:04. PIRC didn't arrive at the hospital until 7 o'clock that evening. Is there a way that that period could be reduced?
Yeah, I probably could.
Any suggestions that you could make?
Depending, I decided to have that briefing at Hamilton. Could it have been different where we did identify who the scene managers were going to be, that they were deployed directly to that with contact details for the respective scene managers. But then we're still in a position, there's so many different scenes being managed that we would still want to have that forensic strategy meeting with all the relevant people involved in that before we actually went to do that recovery work. So you know, I see the perception as regards time delays, but it's more important to get the approach correct and then carry out that properly.
And in terms of looking at ways that the process could be made more efficient, quicker, can you think of anything that would be able to speed things up?
You're still dealing with an on-call situation. It's the availability of people. The on-call staff, again, they're not all sitting in the house ready to respond to the phone. Sometimes, you know, they will respond, but they may be somewhere else. So there's an awful lot of different factors which will affect that time delay. But that's for us to manage and make it as effective as possible.
And obviously, once the investigators arrived at Kirkcaldy at 1:30 and didn't arrive to the hospital till 7, can you see in that window an opportunity for making the process faster? Obviously, they're in Kirkcaldy by then. There's no issues about them journeying from home. Can you think of any efficiencies?
It's hard to comment without knowing all the factors in relation to that. Scene managers are given a very significant responsibility because they have expertise in what they're doing. Their expertise is much better than mine in relation to that specific task. You know, so if they see fit to, you know, say have that further dialogue and preparation and planning to make that recovery at either scene as professional and thorough as possible without any outside interference, then we just have to accept that. But in the day, there'll always be ways of improving timescales around things, and that would maybe normally involve more resources as well.
So you think perhaps more resources, if you'd had them that day, might have helped speed up the process?
Might have done.
And I'm conscious of the time. We often have a break for the stenographer. Would that be appropriate?
We'll take a 15-minute break now. Ms. Graham.
Thank you. Just before the break, you talked about how the resources have, you think additional resources on the 3rd of May may have made things faster, response time. You've also talked about you had 25 staff at the time in PIRC. You now have about 60, I think you
Just
said.
over, yeah.
Do you know why you have increased resources? Was it something to do with workload, or was it something to do with the recognition that PIRC needed more resources to perhaps be more efficient?
Mainly to do with workload. I think there's been a significant increase over the previous few years, which has been identified, I think, and then appropriate funding was sought to increase the workload, and a change of type of work that we have, which has increased that quite significantly.
So in any individual investigation, would it be similar numbers today that are deployed to deal with that investigation? If the situation on the 3rd of May 2015 happened now, would more officers be sent or the same numbers?
I would say more, but because we would initially have to resource the post-incident process, so that in itself would be a prerequisite to supplement the on-call staff with additional resources, and then assess what else was required or would be perceived as required for that part of that initial response. So the chances are it would be a lot more.
And when you say a lot more, if it happened today, how many investigators from PIRC would go to the police office?
Well, it would depend a lot. As we said, that we spoke about the post-incident process in isolation itself. You know, we have instances where we have more than one, so we have to send the numbers that were on that documentation that we looked at to each of those. Then if we have more than one scene or locus, then likewise we would need to resource that with supervisors and with appropriately skilled staff, and any other requirements we thought we would have for that.
So
I think the real-time transcription is not working, but I think we'll just carry on and the stenographer can catch up and we'll see how it develops.
Thank you. So if you were appointed as lead investigator today in a similar situation, can you help the chair and by giving him some understanding of the number of PIRC investigators that would be sent in a similar situation today, assuming there was a post-incident procedure in place?
There would be, if it was a significant critical incident, then there would be a post-incident process. So you would have at least two would go to carry out the process within the post-incident procedure. I say we would potentially have 3 or 4 would go to each location. A senior investigator would be in charge of overseeing these scenes and linking in with Police Scotland as well. You may have parallel criminal investigations ongoing. It may be part of an ongoing crime in action where somebody has been shot, for instance, but there is still police involvement in that, but there is a role for us to investigate that shooting as well. So there's various permutations where the level and number of resources could increase just depending on what it is and what we're faced with.
So in a situation like existed on the 3rd of May 2015, where a man has been restrained by the police, there are 9 attending officers who've been involved as witnesses. There is the scene where it happened, Hayfield Road. There is the hospital where the body remains, Victoria Hospital. How many PIRC investigators would be sent? to Hayfield Road, for example. Let's start with Hayfield Road.
But again, it would depend on application, what the perceived level of involvement, what inquiries may be coming from that.
Mr. Harrower, I think
Yeah.
that you're being asked to look at the situation as it was on the 3rd of May 2015 and indicate what resources would be sent to the same situation, a similar situation today.
Thank you.
I think you'd potentially have 2 senior investigators, one to oversee the post-incident process, one to link between the 2 scenes. You'd have scene managers for each, plus another investigator. You would, I think, at least have another couple looking at other parts of the investigation. It may be that you would potentially start the house-to-house inquiry, as we did at Police Scotland were doing that on our behalf, but we may decide, depending on the circumstances, to initiate that ourselves. Obviously, we'd have the question of the family liaison officers, whether they were deployed at that time or they were initially deployed by Police Scotland with a follow-up, and that would be another consideration at that stage as well.
So I don't have the benefit of the transcript, but you spoke about perhaps having 2 senior investigators engaged.
Potentially,
Potentially.
a very critical incident.
And you said, and with investigators, would that be each senior investigator would have a further investigator to assist?
Yes. Yeah.
And would there also be a scribe for each senior investigator?
Well, it'd be probably a scribe with each of them. Then you would have your 2 investigators who are dealing with the scene. So it might be 2 scene investigators, or certainly an experienced scene investigator with another for each of those scenes as well.
And would there be production officers or investigators appointed to the role of production officer?
Possibly, but
At each scene?
the way that worked during this, they would deal with the productions for their own scene, potentially. But if there was perceived there was going to be a lot involved in it, you may have separate production officers out as a separate resource.
And we've heard reference to the scene manager, like a PIRC scene manager.
Yeah.
Would that be in addition to these investigators?
No,
Or they would take on that
yeah,
role?
the scene managers are investigators who have that specific skill base.
And you may initiate house to house. Would that involve 2 investigators?
Well, to do a house-to-house properly, I think I don't know how many PIRC investigators are involved in that. When I think that started the following day, there would be a lot more than 2. There would be a significant number involved in that.
And you mentioned flows. How many investigators would take on the role of flow?
2.
So there'd be 2 flows as well. Anyone else that I've missed out?
Don't think so.
So there could be a significantly large number if PIRC were to take over. If the investigation by PIRC now involved the events leading up to Mr. Bio's arrival at Hayfield Road, would there be additional investigators appointed to deal with other scenes and other parts of the investigation?
I don't think the circumstances still PIRC would be able to do that exclusively. I don't think in those early stages, and particularly where houses were being locked down, etc., as I'm aware. So they would have to have the assistance of Police Scotland to do that.
So that type of part of the investigation would still you'd have to rely on the support of Police Scotland
Support,
officers. Yeah. Thank you. We were talking about the arrival of PIRC at various locations. I'd like to talk about the arrival of PIRC investigators at the scene at Hayfield Road on the 3rd of May 2015. Now, they arrived at 7:20 in the evening, so effectively 12 hours after the police first arrived at Hayfield Road on the Sunday morning. Now, looking at that period of 12 hours, you've talked about the police had the scene, they had Hayfield
Yeah.
Road. We've heard evidence from officers about the police taking control and, if I could say, setting up cordons, but making sure that the area was kept free of members of the public.
Yeah.
Do you have any concerns about that period being, before PIRC get there, being as long as 12 hours? Say, for example, in relation to forensic recovery of items from the scene, are you concerned about that?
So I think my answer would be very similar to in relation to Victoria Hospital, where I'm greatly reliant on the scene managers and their expertise and the preparations that they need to make to do a professional job of recovering any available evidence that's at the scene. If they could have been there any earlier, in my view, they would have been there.
And are you concerned at all about the perception of officers in uniform at the scene? So, from the public point of view, although PIRC are supposed to be independent and taking
Yep.
charge of the investigation, at the actual scene itself, the public see officers in uniform, Police Scotland officers, not PIRC investigators. Do you think that causes concern generally?
I can understand that potentially to some degree the adverse perception of that, but it doesn't cause me concerns as such, because to control these scenes in the main requires police support, because there's an abundance of issues that PIRC investigators wouldn't be able to deal with that may arise with people trying to cross that scene, and then whatever action would have to be taken as a result of that. So, and as we discussed, the powers of constable that our investigators have, which doesn't include members of the public. So we would then have to seek assistance of Police Scotland then, and it may be too late that something has actually happened and the scene has been breached.
So I asked you before about thinking of ways that efficiencies or time savings could be made, and I'm wondering if, looking at that situation now, you've told us that you arrived at Kirkcaldy with the investigators at 1:30. You'd given them a briefing in advance of that and told them what they were going to be doing. So officers had been allocated to attend Hayfield
Yep.
Road. But the officers didn't actually arrive till 7:20 in the evening. And looking at that response time now, do you think there's ways that that could have been quicker, that they could have got there sooner?
Well, there's one thing we didn't mention as far as Hayfield Road is Gary Sinclair, the scene manager, who was tasked to control that, say, also his role extended to various tasks at Kirkcaldy. So now I think we need maybe double check his statement, but I think he had to deal with the recovery of the police safety equipment and uniforms, etc. Now that was initially, I was told in the morning that was ongoing before I got there, but that transpired not to be the case. So I think him and Morris Rhodes, I think it was, were involved in that for probably a significant period before they ultimately linked in with the scene managers at Hayfield Road itself, so that might have answered part of that, I think. So the further answer to your question then may have been resource-wise, that, you know, if there'd been another pairing available that could have dealt with everything at the office, which would have released them earlier to go to that.
So another pairing, extra investigators, or
Could have dealt with the various tasks at Kirkcaldy Police
so
Station.
if there'd been another pair of hands or another body, you could have allocated roles separately.
Yeah.
Just to ask you about the recovery of the clothing or equipment from the officers, When did you become aware that the officers had returned to Kirkcaldy Police Office?
I would think the first discussion I had with Pat Campbell, I would think. I don't think it came up in conversation with PSD, so it would be shortly after with Pat Campbell.
Did you know they were in the canteen?
Not at that stage, I don't think. I just knew they were at the office.
When did you become aware they were at the canteen?
Later in the day, I can't be specific with times. I think it was after we arrived at the office, I think.
After 1:30?
Yeah.
Was it after a Gold Group meeting or was it after some other event?
Honestly, I'm not sure. I can't remember.
And you said that you were under the impression earlier that the equipment was going to be recovered.
Yes, much earlier, yeah.
What time?
I think it's mentioned in my notes with, it's possibly the first conversation I had with Pat Campbell, that was, the inference was that was ongoing at that time, which was back at 10 o'clock.
And what were your expectations then about what would be happening with the officers' clothing and their equipment? What were you expecting to happen?
From what I was told, that would have been all secured, packaged, and be retained.
And when you say secured, what do you mean?
Sealed in bags, following the appropriate processes for recovery of.
We've seen some of these brown bags with a clear strip that are sealed.
Yeah,
forensic,
similar
type
to
of
that,
thing.
and identification of who's taken it and what it is and who it belongs to.
Thank you. And retained, what do you mean by retained?
It would be kept and passed to us.
And in terms of ensuring the forensic integrity or recovering evidence in a forensically secure way, is that the type of thing you were expecting to be done with equipment
Yes.
and clothing?
Yeah.
If we've heard evidence that when the officers returned to Kirkcaldy, that clothing, vests, equipment was left out in the canteen.
I'm aware of that, yeah.
Are you aware of that
Yeah.
from the inquiry, are
Yes.
you? And if you're aware of that, do you have concerns about that?
Yes.
Can you tell us about those concerns?
Well, obviously, the preference that these were taken, again, that's something that would have covered in the post-incident process. If it was seen as a requirement, a necessity to take that would have been dealt with in a much more forensic fashion at an early stage. But that, from what I've seen, that didn't occur at that stage. So Gary Sinclair and his colleague were involved. I don't know what stage it was at as regards when he got involved in the recovery of that, but it obviously hadn't happened on the timescale that had initially intimated to me. So the fact that that was, if it was as reported, lying about kind of in different places and people asking, that was not ideal, not good.
And did you become aware at a later time in that day, during the day, that there had not been recovery of the clothing and equipment, and in relation to the officers?
I think I fully became aware of that it hadn't been done, I think was possibly at the beginning of the forensic strategy meeting. It may have been, that's my recollection. And then that's when Gary was redirected to, once we concluded that, to bring that, oversee that process, and the additional instruction in relation to the Pava spray canisters as well.
And at that point, either during or after the forensic strategy meeting, what was your expectation in terms of recovery at that time?
That if the recovery had commenced, that it was completed, fully overseen by the PIRC staff.
Were you aware at that time that there was an allegation that the female police officer, Nicole Short, one of the officers who was at the scene, had been injured?
Yes, because I had requested that an apparent injury was photographed. I think that was during that meeting as well.
Was that the forensic strategy
Yes.
meeting? Now, the briefing note that we will come to that you'd prepared that day makes the comment that one of the female officers was apparently kicked in the back and also sustained a blow to the back of the head.
Yeah.
You asked for the injuries to be photographed, but in respect of the head injury, I'm wondering, were you taking a view that there were no injuries because of a kick to the back, or?
No, I think there's reference as well to medical examinations of the officers, I think.
We've heard evidence
Yeah.
about that. So what were you looking for in terms of preserving evidence and asking for photographs?
It was to photograph any apparent injuries at that time, and then that would probably be done again if it was the likes of a bruising or anything that
We've heard
came
evidence
as
that
a result of
bruising
that.
can develop
Yes,
over a period
so
of
it
time.
would be a period later to be specified, and when that would be done again to capture that as well.
So was it part of your instruction only to take photographs of head injuries, or was it just to take photographs of any injuries?
The injuries,
Any injuries? Not restricted to head?
I don't think so.
Was any discussion, did you get involved in any discussion at the forensic strategy meeting about recovery of the vest that Nicole Short was wearing, the police vest?
I don't think that specifically, but obviously everything was being recovered, including that.
Was there any discussion at that time about doing any sort of forensic comparison between the vest and the footwear of Mr. Bio?
Not at that time. No.
If there had been any marks on the vest, would you have, that you were aware of, would you have been instructing comparisons to be carried out?
Not at that time, but it would be done, yeah, definitely.
I think in your inquiry statement you say that you did not have any contact with the police officers in the canteen that day.
That's correct.
And as part of your role as lead investigator, would you have expected to have contact with the officers?
No, not then, but now very much so, yeah.
Tell us what you do now.
Again, as part of the post-incident process, that certainly if I was involved in that, which I have been on a few occasions, after introduction to the post-incident manager, I would get an introduction to the officers or police staff. I would identify who I am, outline the role of the PIRC if they were unaware of it, and make them aware of their status at that particular time.
Did anyone from PIRC go to the canteen to speak with any of the officers?
No.
On reflection now, obviously the practice has changed. Do you think there's advantages to the change in that practice, which you didn't have in 2015?
Very much so, yeah.
Tell us
Huge
what-
improvement.
Huge. Tell us why you consider that a huge improvement.
Because it's all about communication. I think we maybe don't have proper consideration of somebody that's never been involved with our organisation before. I mean, there's still officers that have very little awareness of what we do, the types of investigations we do, why we do them, and what the outcome of these are. So it's really good practice to do that introduction, make them aware of what their personal situation is, and the fact that there's going to be a wider investigation. If I had done that on the day, maybe now I wish I did. But
Can you explain to me why you didn't do that?
at that time, sir, most or in fact, all of the communications with officers in relation to our investigations were done through police senior managers. And that was the practice at that time, but say that's changed wholesale now.
But what was the rationale for that? I'm trying to understand why that was done.
I don't think I can give you a full answer to that. That was the way it was done at the time. And I say even in relation to requests for witness statements, that was done through senior management as well. But the difference was with the post-incident process was different in relation to the firearms.
Sorry. Apart from that practice, was there anything to prevent you going into the canteen, telling them who you were, telling them you're in charge, and taking it from there?
No, I offered to do it, but I didn't pursue that later, and maybe on reflection, that could have been done.
So perhaps Ms. Graham could take that on as to whom you offered that to and so forth.
In terms of, you've said you offered to speak to the officers. Do you remember when that was?
Yeah, it was after, I think it was the back of 3 o'clock, after Pat Campbell had come back to me and said that the officers, on legal advice from that had come through the Federation, that they weren't going to provide statements. At that stage, I said I would go and speak to them, clarify their status, and see if that made any difference.
So this would be after the second Gold Group meeting, the one that you attended at 2:40? And what was Pat Campbell's response to that suggestion by you?
I can't remember a verbal response, but I took it at that point that he was taking that away to offer that up, whether it be through the Federation representative or otherwise.
And what was the response ultimately that you received in relation to that suggestion?
No response to that.
Did you follow that up at
No,
any
I didn't.
time?
And I say in hindsight, that's possibly something I could have done.
Looking at it now, do you consider that perhaps going through and making requests through Police Scotland perhaps looks slightly deferential to Police Scotland when you're supposed to be in charge and taking the lead on matters?
Possibly.
And if you had taken the initiative and gone, when would you have gone to speak to the officers?
As soon as somebody came back to me and said, yeah, that's fine.
So if Pat Campbell had come back to you and said yes or no, what would you have done?
If
he'd come back to you and said yes, go and see the officers, or no, we don't
I
want
would have done that.
If he'd said yes, what if he'd said no, we don't want you to do that?
I don't know, actually. I'm not sure. I think it would have to be in that position to actually. I would probably have questioned them further on how would you get that response in the first place, and then make a decision from there.
Now, we've heard evidence, and you've just mentioned that officers were refusing to provide, or were not prepared to give statements.
Yeah.
And was it Pat Campbell that told you it was on the basis of legal advice that
Yes.
they'd received? And was that linked to advice that they'd apparently received from the Federation or
Representative, yeah.
through a representative? Can I confirm, you mentioned this earlier, was the status of the officers at that time, did it remain witnessy as
Yes.
a witness?
Didn't change.
We've heard evidence from Amanda Given, who was the Federation rep on that day, and she has said that the officers absolutely didn't have clarification of status. She said she was absolutely certain that during the day they didn't have clarification of their status. Can you explain why that was, if that's correct?
No, I can't, because it was quite clear. It was raised with Pat Campbell. I know Pat Campbell referred to that His position was that there were witnesses throughout as well. I mentioned in the goal group meeting that that they were all witnesses, and we would be requiring statements from them in due course.
So when was the first time that you remember saying to Pat Campbell, for example, that the officer's status was of witness?
I think it was either in the first or the second telephone conversation with him before we got to Kirkcaldy.
And during the course of that day, how many times did you speak to Pat Campbell about the status of the officers?
One for definite, and the second occasion would be during the goal group meeting where he was there along with ACC Nicholson and the other Police Scotland staff.
I think in your statement you say you thought Trickett was maybe present at a gold group meeting.
Yeah, I understand he maybe wasn't there, but I thought he was. Yeah.
Well, we heard evidence from Conrad Trickett that he didn't go to the gold group meetings that day. That there'd been a conversation between him and Gary McEwen that he was better to spend time with the officers instead of attending the gold group meetings. Looking back now, do you think that the level of communication between yourself and Police Scotland about the status of the officers could have been improved?
No, it was very clear.
Was there any, we've also heard evidence about some of the officers may have wanted their status confirmed in writing. Was there any reason why PIRC would have been reluctant to put that status in writing?
I wasn't aware of any such request.
If you had been asked on the 3rd of May to put that in writing, what would your response have been to that sort of request?
That probably would have initiated going to speak to the officers direct again and giving that one to the group clarification at all if they need it. I say it had been conveyed through Police Scotland, but the response was that on the legal advice that they had, so that was what my assertion was, that wasn't going to change in the short term. But there was never any indication to me that they were unaware of what their status was.
When you heard that they weren't willing to give statements, at that point did you consider speaking to them direct, the officers?
Yeah, well that was the point when I was made aware with Pat Campbell and that offer was made. But I say in hindsight we could have potentially followed that up more strongly.
Can we perhaps look at the Gold Group meeting minutes for that meeting, PS 07268. And you'll see that the time there is given as 14:40. You're present at that time, Keith Harrower, and also John Ferguson, who I understand was an investigator for PIRC as well.
Yes.
Now, just shortly prior to this meeting, you've arrived in Kirkcaldy Police Office and you've had a handover with Pat Campbell.
Yes.
And who else was at the handover? We've heard evidence, I think, that Leslie Bowl was there. Do you remember her?
Yeah, I'm sure there was more of our staff. I don't know if they were all there or not.
Right. You think all of the PIRC staff?
I'm not sure if they were all there, but there were certainly other PIRC staff there.
Right. And that was the first face-to-face discussion that you'd had with Pat Campbell, the SIO?
Yes.
Can you tell us the version that you were given of events at that handover? Now, you may want to look at your operational notes, I think page 8.
What time was that again? I've not got actual
Well,
page
this would be
numbers
round
here.
about 1:30.
There's no notes regarding that specifically. The notes are in relation to the following, the goal group meeting at just after 2 o'clock.
Was there any difference between the version you were given at the handover compared to what you'd been told by Green,
No,
Blackhall and
not,
Campbell?
not from my recollection. It's pretty much mirrored our second discussion with Pat Campbell, and then I think more about what was going on elsewhere at the other locations.
You've said in your statement you were satisfied in relation to the handover yourself. We've heard evidence from Pat Campbell and Leslie Bowle about the handover. And Leslie Bowle, I'll just read this out. She gave evidence on the 66th day of the inquiry on the 1st of September last year and said, for me it wasn't at a sufficient level. She described it as there were a couple of, if I can call it, tumbleweed moments. To be honest, it was quite uncomfortable. She says, I suppose I thought, perhaps wrongly, that PIRC would come in and, you know, there would be a discussion as to what they wanted, because my impression was that they were going to lead the investigation and Police Scotland were there to provide any support that they so required. I highlighted the fact that there may be other specialists available to start drawing up strategies for other areas. And my thought was, well, Police Scotland could draw up a strategy, hand it to PIRC. They could either accept it, amend it or reject it. It was up to them. And I thought that'd be helpful. And she said there wasn't obvious information coming from the meeting. Do you have any comments about what Leslie Bowle said to the inquiry about the handover not being at a sufficient level?
No, that's clearly her opinion. I don't think Pat Campbell articulated along similar lines. I was aware, I was satisfied from the information I got, and then subsequently from the goal group meeting to then move forward to do the priority actions that we had to do.
So you were satisfied with the quality of that meeting, that handover between Police Scotland and PIRC
Yes.
at that time? Can I ask you about let's go back to the Gold Group minutes, which we have on the screen. And you'll see that as we go through that, perhaps we could look at page 2. Thank you. You're given a factual update. Pat Campbell talks to the investigative process and details various items that are included. If we can go to the bottom of that page, it says FLO to be briefed in relation to equality and diversity. Next of kin has been informed by DC Parker and DC Mitchell. And just above that, there's next of kin strategy. Partner of deceased made aware and statement noted. No formal ID has taken place, but ID has been done by a Facebook image initially. Next of kin identified as sister and an FLO being identified. 2 Police Scotland FLOs have been identified. 1 is DI as FLO to brief and coordinate. Can you tell me what your expectations were at that time in relation to FLOs?
It had been discussed at an early stage with Pat Campbell prior to arriving, and that the Police Scotland flows were going to be deployed. There was no question over that at that stage, and obviously that hadn't changed at that time. That was part of the plan, and I was satisfied with that. I knew that at some stage, an early stage, our flows would be deployed, but not that day, and then they would have an appropriate time to be briefed for a handover for the family at the appropriate stage.
Can you explain why there were no FLOs from PIRC available that day?
Available as in?
Well, you've said that there were no flows. We've heard evidence there were no PIRC flows.
No, there
that
were
day.
none there, and there were none on, well, there was one that was on call who, John Ferguson, was a flow as well, but obviously he was otherwise engaged, so we didn't pursue trying to get any trained flows at that stage, as were the commitment from Police Scotland that these flows would be deployed.
So your understanding was that Police Scotland were deploying flows for use that day.
Yes.
And although John Ferguson was a trained flow,
Yeah.
he was engaged with other tasks.
Yeah, he was going to be dealing with Mr. Boy's body.
And if you had had extra resources or another pair of hands, would that have freed up John Ferguson and released him to allow him to perform FLO tasks?
It could have done, yeah.
So if you'd had extra PIRC staff investigators, could you have found PIRC flows that day?
I may have been able to, I made attempts anyway to call them out in addition to that. But so I was satisfied with the arrangements that were in place at that time.
So you were satisfied that flows would be provided by Police Scotland?
Yes.
And did it matter at all that PIRC were responsible for the investigation into the death of Mr. Bio, or you were happy that Police Scotland should be dealing with the matter and flows?
At the initial stage, but that would change. I mean, that happens a lot where you have critical incidents where, particularly at that time, where Police Scotland would deploy flows initially for a variety of reasons, and that's speedily turned around depending on where the location is, etc. And then they would have a comprehensive handover with our staff to the family, who would then continue it to the end of the investigation.
We've heard some evidence about flows, and I hope to be able to, we'll be hearing more evidence later in the inquiry. Is it the case that when you have a flow, that it's an important aspect to build relationships and good relationships with the next of kin or
Yes.
the family? Is that not easier if it's the same person that's continuing to maintain that contact with the family, rather than chopping and changing?
It could be in a lot of circumstances, yeah.
Would there have been benefits in appointing PIRC flows that day and maintaining that contact between PIRC flows and the family?
There may have been, particularly in hindsight, with how things went with Police Scotland and the response by the family.
Nowadays, would you appoint PIRC flows sooner, so you have that reassurance that you know who's going and who's staying with
To
the
be honest, I
family?
mean, Alistair will be better informed to give you more information on that, but just now my understanding is that it happens both ways still. I mean, I've recently dealt with other deaths where initially Police Scotland flows would be deployed, and then I say we then hand over, and there'll be a variety of reasons for that.
And in terms of best practice, what's the best option for the family? Having the Police Scotland flow initially and then changing, or having PIRC flows and staying?
Some families that might work adequately well, there's not an issue with that. Others that it would work much better if there's that continuity, as you refer to, throughout. I think people will be very different. They are carrying out the same function.
Now, as lead investigator, you're obviously juggling resources and making decisions about who's to go where. Is this a situation where you prioritised John Ferguson for his role in going to Victoria Hospital?
Yeah, he was called out specifically for his skill base as a scene manager.
So you utilised him for scene management sort of experience that he had,
And Gary
rather
Sinclair
than
likewise.
as a, sorry, Gary Sinclair, like,
Yeah, likewise.
rather than any flow experience that Mr. Ferguson had.
Yes.
In hindsight now, looking at that decision, do you think it would have been better to prioritise flow over scene management?
I mean, at the time, I was more than content with the arrangements that are in place. And I say that it happened on numerous occasions the same way in relation to the family liaison officers. So I was more than content at the time with that. But obviously the circumstances changed very late in the day.
Can I ask you about delivery of the death message? We've heard a lot of evidence about that.
Yep.
And that was delivered by Police Scotland officers.
Yep.
We've heard from both of them. Looking to the future, obviously, I'm interested in whether you think PIRC could take a more proactive role in relation to delivery of the death message. So in a situation where PIRC are brought in to investigate a death, and there's going to be liaison with the family, there's going to be contact with the family, perhaps for a sustained period, do you think there would be any benefit in having PIRC take a more proactive role in relation to that?
I think there would be a lot of issues with that. The death message, I've heard significant discussion as regards the delays to the family, quite rightly, that it was a lengthy period of time before they were made aware. It's important that they are made aware at a very early juncture. Now, to put that into the responsibility of PIRC flows that may be travelling 2 or 3 hours to get to a location, I think it's impractical. As far as we're concerned, it's a police responsibility to deliver that death message, deliver it in an appropriate manner with relevant information of what can be said at the time. And I think that was the issue here.
And when you say, Police Scotland responsibility at a very early juncture,
yes,
the death message should be delivered. When you say that, a very early juncture, what timescale are you considering to be appropriate?
As soon as reasonably practical. Now, in different circumstances, again, that depends where the family members are. There could be travel involved to do that personally, obviously. It has to be done in person, or should be. So, but it has to be there as a high priority to have that action completed.
When did you become aware that obviously we can see in the minutes of this Gold Group meeting that you're told next of kin has been informed by DC Parker and DC Mitchell. We've heard evidence that this actually wasn't until shortly after 3 o'clock that they arrived at the home of the Johnsons. When did you become aware for the first time that the death message had been delivered to the family? Was it at this meeting, or was it earlier or later?
I'm not sure. I was aware it hadn't been passed, I think, when I arrived at Kirkcaldy. As far as specifically when I was told that it had been passed, because I know it was initially under consideration that the flows would deliver the death message. I'm sure that was...
We've heard people speak of that.
Yeah, but I mean, that was, to my mind, was inappropriate as well. So that was, I think, quickly turned around to whatever the decision process was about who actually delivered that and what was said.
And prior to this Gold Group meeting, who was it that told you the death message hadn't been delivered?
I'm not 100% sure. I would anticipate it came from Pat Campbell, because the majority of the information on the ongoing issues were coming through him, but I don't know that for sure.
And did that cause you concern from a PIRC perspective, that the family hadn't
Yes.
been up till then? And what were those concerns? What was the basis for those concerns?
It's the right for the family to know that they should be made aware of losing a close relative, and it's only right and proper that that's delivered at an early juncture.
And then we see on the next page, it's at item 5 on the agenda of this meeting. There's discussion there of family concerns, Detective Inspector Robson. Discussion regarding next of kin strategy identified as sister of deceased Colette Bell. Girlfriend of deceased is currently within Kirkcaldy Police Station and has been informed a deceased person is in hospital and it may be her partner. Do you remember discussion at that time about family concerns?
No, I don't recall. Obviously it's taken place, but I don't recall any specifics on that.
And then for completeness, paragraph 8, item 8 on the agenda is headed up staff welfare. Now, this name next to it is Chief Inspector Trickett. Now, as I said earlier, we've heard from Conrad Trickett that he didn't attend the Gold Group meetings that morning. You've mentioned that you thought he was
I thought
one
he was
of
there,
them.
yeah.
Do you remember this discussion about staff welfare and who led on that discussion?
All I can recall, and I can't remember if it was Pat Campbell that told me what Chief Inspector Trickett's function was there, which was welfare and support of the officers. That was what was articulated to me, but that's all I can remember about that.
And it says there, Trickett and 2 Fed reps have been with officers providing support and assistance throughout the day. There's no mention there of post-incident procedures having
No.
been implemented. Thank you. Can I ask you about we talked about it earlier, the parallel investigation, the part of the investigation that Police Scotland were conducting about events leading up to the arrival of Mr. Bio at Hayfield Road. Were you kept up to date on that aspect of the police investigation?
Yeah, Pat Campbell gave me updates at different intervals on, I think, developments with houses, etc.
And did the Gold Group meetings cover both those elements?
Yeah, I believe so.
The police aspect of the investigation and the PIRC aspect?
Yes.
Looking back now, did that help or did it hinder? Did it cause confusion or was it of assistance?
No, I don't think it caused confusion. I said it was helpful from my perspective just to know what was going on in relation to the other incidents and any significant developments from there.
And can I be clear, PIRC had at that time no responsibility at all in relation to the matters leading up to the arrival of Mr. Bio in
No.
Hayfield Road. So we've heard evidence from a number of witnesses about searches of properties or seizing properties or police arriving at properties in relation to Colette Bell, Martin Dick, Kirsty MacLeod and Mr. Saeed's family home, a number of his relatives. Were PIRC involved with any of that?
No.
Were you responsible for any decisions taken in relation to that?
No.
And were you aware of the legal basis upon which it was intended to seize or search any of those properties?
I think there was certainly a reference at some point to seeking permission of the respective householders to undertake that activity. I'm sure that was mentioned at some stage during the forensic strategy meeting, I think. Although I don't think it was recorded within the minutes or anything for that. But,
For example, we've heard that from evidence from a Mrs. Rashid and a Mr. Ahmed, and we've seen the scene entry log of the police arriving at their home at round about 1:30 in the afternoon. My understanding is that would have been prior to the forensic strategy meeting. Is that correct?
it would have been, yeah.
Who was it that discussed permission of householders at the forensic strategy meeting?
I don't know who raised the topic. I just have recollection of it being mentioned at some point, and I thought it related to that meeting. I say there was no direct discussion and, you know, how that would be approached, what our viewpoint was on it, because it wasn't relevant to us.
Right, thank you. Now, if you could give me a moment, I'm about to move on to another topic. Would you wish me to continue, or?
I think given the time, this would be an appropriate moment to rise. So we'll continue with your evidence tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, Mr. Harrower. Thank you. Adjourn till 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.